They invited me to that gala for one reason only: to humiliate me. The flash of cameras hit like lightning as the Rolls-Royce Phantom door opened. I could hear the collective gasp ripple through the crowd, disbelief crashing against the velvet ropes. My hand rested on his arm, the billionaire everyone whispered about but never expected to see beside me. The same people who mocked me, dismissed me, erased me from their golden circle froze in place, champagne glasses suspended midair. Marcus was there too, and when our eyes met, his perfectly rehearsed smile collapsed into something I had never seen before: fear. What none of them knew was that I wasn't the same girl they had thrown away. But this story didn't begin on a red carpet. It began months earlier, with a different invitation. The invitation arrived on a quiet afternoon, slipped under my door like it didn't matter. Heavy paper, gold lettering, the kind of envelope that smells like old money and quiet cruelty. "You are cordially invited." I didn't smile. I already knew what this was. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, slipped under my apartment door like a cruel joke. Heavy cardstock, gold-embossed lettering, the kind of paper that screamed old money and older cruelty. Marcus Whitfield cordially invites you to celebrate his engagement at the Peninsula Hotel. My hands trembled as I read it, not from excitement, but from the sick recognition of what this really was. Marcus didn't want me there to celebrate. He wanted an audience for my humiliation. But I had no idea what accepting would cost me. We had dated for 3 years, or at least I thought we had. I was the scholarship girl who tutored him through economics, who believed him when he said my background didn't matter, who was naive enough to think love could bridge the canyon between his world and mine. Then I overheard him at that country club lunch 6 months ago, laughing with his friends about his charity project girlfriend, and how amusing it was to watch me try to fit in. I ended it that night, or so I thought. But Marcus wasn't done with me yet. I knew exactly what this invitation meant. He wanted me to show up poor, underdressed, alone. A living testament to the natural order of things, a cautionary tale for anyone who dared to reach above their station. His fiancée would be dripping in diamonds, her pedigree as spotless as her trust fund, and I would be the ghost of his slumming phase, the embarrassing footnote he could finally erase in front of everyone who mattered. The cruelty wasn't in the invitation itself. It was in the certainty that I would feel obligated to come, that some pathetic part of me would still care enough to witness my own execution. But that day, everything shifted. I stared at that invitation for 3 days, feeling the familiar weight of invisibility pressing down on my chest. This was the world I had tasted and been spat out from. A world where your worth was measured by your last name and your stock portfolio, where kindness was a transaction, and love was a luxury reserved for those who could afford to waste it. Every fiber of my being screamed to throw it away, to disappear, to accept that girls like me didn't get to rewrite endings written by people like him. But something else stirred inside me too, something dangerous and electric. What if I didn't have to be the victim in his story anymore? But I was wrong about what that transformation would require. I grew up watching my mother's hand shake as she counted bills under our kitchen's flickering fluorescent light. 1-bedroom apartment in Queens. The radiator clanged like a warning every winter night, and the smell of her double shifts at the diner, grease and exhaustion, clung to everything we owned. My father left when I was 7, and my mother never spoke his name again. She poured herself into work, into survival, into making sure I had notebooks and a chance at something better. But I had no idea how deep that sacrifice ran. I learned early that the world wasn't interested in fairness. Opportunities didn't knock on doors in neighborhoods like ours. I watched brilliant kids from my high school disappear into dead-end jobs because no one told them about scholarships or application deadlines. I watched my mother age a decade in 5 years, her dreams shrinking to fit inside the margins of our rent payments. I promised myself I would be different. I would claw my way out, but everything I believed about escape was about to collapse. Full scholarship to Columbia. Summa cum laude. Fluent in 3 languages by 22. I worked every angle, tutoring wealthy students in their penthouses, translating documents at midnight, analyzing market trends for pocket change. I thought education was the great equalizer. that intelligence could override circumstance. Then I met Marcus and his world, and I realized how profoundly, devastatingly wrong I had been. They didn't care about intelligence. They cared about bloodlines and trust funds, about who your parents were and which clubs they belonged to. But that realization would become my greatest weapon. After Marcus, I moved to an even smaller apartment, took on more freelance work, tried to rebuild myself from the shards of my shattered illusions. I was nobody again, invisible again, poor again. All the things his world had always seen when they looked at me, no matter how hard I had worked to prove otherwise. The isolation was suffocating. Every coffee shop in Manhattan felt like enemy territory, every well-dressed couple a reminder of what I had lost. Or rather, what I had never really had. I was drowning in my own insignificance. And the invitation from Marcus felt like he was offering me a stone instead of a lifeline. But I had no idea someone was already watching me sink. I met Alexander Crane by accident, which is the only way someone like me ever meets someone like him. I was translating a German contract at a boutique cafe near the financial district, my third espresso turning cold beside my laptop. He sat down at the next table, opened his own computer, and within 10 minutes, we were both cursing at the same corrupted file format. Our eyes met, and he laughed. This genuine, unguarded sound that seemed impossible from a man in a $15,000 suit. But I had no idea who he was. We started talking about data recovery, then linguistics, then somehow the ethical implications of algorithmic trading. He didn't ask where I went to school or who my family was. He listened to my ideas about market inefficiencies like they mattered, challenged my assumptions like I was worth the effort. I didn't know who he was. Not then. I just knew that for the first time in months, someone was seeing me instead of looking through me. When he finally introduced himself, extending his hand with that slight smile, I felt my stomach drop. Alexander Crane. The Alexander Crane. The billionaire who had revolutionized fintech before he turned 30. But that moment would change everything. He asked if I wanted to work with him, not for him. A consulting position analyzing international markets, leveraging my language skills and economic training. The pay was staggering, but that wasn't what made me say yes. It was the way he spoke about potential, about how talent wasted was a tragedy regardless of where it originated. He had grown up in foster care, built his empire from code written in public libraries, and he had no patience for the artificial hierarchies that Marcus's world worshipped. But I had no idea what was coming next. Over the next 3 months, I didn't just work for Alexander. I learned from him, evolved with him, discovered that my instincts were sharper than I had ever believed possible. But I never told him about Marcus or the invitation burning a hole in my desk drawer. Not until the day I finally broke, 2 weeks before the engagement party, when he found me staring at that gold-embossed cardstock with tears streaming down my face. He read it once, and his expression shifted into something I hadn't seen before. Controlled fury. He asked me one question. "Do you want to go?" I told him the truth. I wanted to show them I was more than their cruelty, more than their dismissal, more than the convenient story they had written about me. He smiled then, and it was the smile of someone who had fought these battles before and knew exactly how to win them. "Then let's make sure they never forget it." But I was wrong about what that really meant. Alexander didn't just offer to escort me to Marcus's engagement party. He orchestrated a transformation, but not the kind I expected. There were no montages of makeovers or lessons in etiquette. Instead, he gave me something far more powerful, the truth about who I had always been. He showed me the analyses I had written that had saved his company millions, the contract negotiations where my linguistic precision had outmaneuvered corporate lawyers, the market predictions that had proven more accurate than entire teams of Ivy League analysts. But that was only the beginning. He introduced me to his inner circle, not as his protege, but as his partner on a new venture. We were launching an international investment fund focused on overlooked markets, and I would be the lead strategist. The paperwork was already filed, the capital already committed. the press release already drafted. This wasn't charity or revenge theater. This was real, and it was mine. The weight of that realization nearly broke me. I had spent so long believing that people like Marcus held all the power, that their acceptance was the only validation that mattered. But Alexander was showing me a different truth. Their world was smaller than they pretended, and their power was mostly smoke and mirrors maintained by people too afraid to call their bluff. But I had no idea how completely I was about to prove that. The night before the party, Alexander took me to his private tailor. The gown they created wasn't just beautiful, it was strategic. Midnight blue silk that caught the light like water, cut with architectural precision, expensive in a way that whispered rather than shouted. The jewelry was minimal, a single diamond pendant that cost more than Marcus's car, borrowed from a collection that had graced European royalty. But the real transformation was internal. I looked in the mirror and saw someone who belonged to herself, who didn't need their permission or their approval, who had built something real instead of borrowing someone else's shine. But that moment would cost Marcus far more than he knew. Alexander briefed me with military precision. We would arrive exactly 30 minutes late, enough to ensure everyone was already there, but not so late as to seem desperate for attention. The Rolls-Royce was his personal vehicle, vintage but impeccably maintained, a rolling statement of wealth that predated the nouveau riche anxiety of Marcus's crowd. He would introduce me not as his date, but as his business partner, the architect of a venture that would be announced in the Wall Street Journal the following morning. Every detail was calculated, but none of it was false. This wasn't a performance. It was simply the truth, presented in a language they would finally understand. He looked at me as we prepared to leave, and said something I would never forget. "You're not going there to prove anything to them. You're going to show them what they were too blind to see." But I had no idea what was coming next. The Rolls-Royce glided to a stop in front of the Peninsula Hotel like a panther approaching prey. Its engine purring so quietly, I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. The valet's eyes widened. He knew this car, knew the weight of the silver spirit of ecstasy on its hood, knew that whoever emerged from it operated on a different frequency of wealth and power. Alexander stepped out first, his movements unhurried, and I heard the whispers start immediately, rippling through the crowd gathered outside like wind through tall grass. "That's Alexander Crane. What's he doing here? Who invited him?" The question hung in the air, electric with possibility. Then he extended his hand back into the car, and I took it, my fingers trembling slightly as they wrapped around his. Time slowed as I stepped onto the red carpet, the midnight blue silk of my gown catching the golden light from 100 bulbs, the diamond at my throat throwing fractured rainbows across the hotel's marble facade. The cameras erupted, a wall of flashing lights and mechanical clicks that sounded like a firing squad. Professional photographers who had been hired to document Marcus's engagement party suddenly had a much more interesting story. I could see the confusion rippling across their faces, the frantic checking of phones and press lists, trying to understand who I was and why I was arriving with one of the most powerful men in the country. But that moment would shatter everything Marcus had built. Alexander's hand rested on the small of my back, protective but not possessive, as we walked through the gauntlet of flashing lights. I kept my chin up, my expression serene, channeling every ounce of grace I had learned not from them, but from my mother, who had walked through far harder trials with far less armor. The warmth of his palm against the cool silk, the weight of the diamond against my collarbone, the click of my heels on stone. Every sensation was magnified, crystalline, burned into my memory with the precision of trauma or triumph. But I had no idea what was waiting inside. Inside, the ballroom fell into a silence so complete I could hear the chandeliers trembling overhead, their crystals singing a high, thin note that only exists in moments of collective shock. Every head turned as one organism. Every conversation died mid-syllable. Every champagne glass froze in mid-toast, bubbles suspended like captured time. I saw them all in that crystalline moment. Marcus's mother, her mouth forming a small O of disbelief. His college friends, their smug expressions cracking like cheap porcelain. The women who had smiled to my face while shredding me behind closed doors, their eyes wide with something between awe and panic. And Marcus himself, standing next to his fiancée, a blonde woman in a white dress who suddenly looked overdressed and underprepared, his face cycling through shock, recognition, and something that looked dangerously close to terror. But everything I believed was about to collapse. Marcus's fiancée recovered first, her finishing school training kicking in as she extended a manicured hand and offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her name was Vanessa, and she had the kind of effortless beauty that came from generations of genetic selection and expensive maintenance. But there was panic behind her politeness, visible in the way her pupils contracted, the way her hand trembled slightly before she steadied it. She kept glancing at Marcus, waiting for him to take control, to explain, to do something other than stand there looking like he had seen a ghost wearing couture. "It's so lovely to meet you," she said, her voice tight. But I had no idea what she was truly feeling. The whispers intensified, spreading through the ballroom like contagion, a low susurrus of shock and recalibration. I caught fragments of conversation as Alexander and I moved through the space. He was introducing me to hedge fund managers, tech entrepreneurs, old money families who suddenly wanted to know everything about our new venture. "Did you know she speaks 5 languages? She predicted the Asian market shift before anyone else. Marcus dated her? God, what an idiot." The social calculus was recalibrating in real time, their previous dismissal of me becoming a liability they needed to quickly disavow. A woman in emeralds leaned toward her companion, her lips barely moving. I always thought she had something special. But that moment would cost her more than a lie. Marcus's mother approached with the kind of forced warmth that barely concealed her rage, her smile stretched too wide, her eyes glittering with something cold and calculating. She had perfected the art of the cutting compliment, and she deployed her arsenal with surgical precision. "How lovely to see you thriving, dear. We always knew you had potential, even if Marcus was too young to appreciate it." But her hands betrayed her, clenched at her sides, knuckles white against the fabric of her Chanel gown. She was furious, not at Marcus for letting me go, but at me for having the audacity to return, transformed. In their world, people like me were supposed to disappear quietly, to accept our place in the hierarchy, to provide cautionary tales rather than comeback stories. My success wasn't inspirational to them. It was threatening, but I was wrong about how deep that threat ran. Alexander stayed close, his presence a shield against the subtle attacks that came disguised as compliments and questions. He had warned me about this, how they would try to minimize my achievements, to frame me as his charity case or his temporary fascination, to find some way to reassert the natural order they believed in. But he also taught me how to counter it, with facts, with confidence, with the unshakable knowledge that I had earned everything I had. When one of Marcus's friends made a joke about how I had traded up, his voice carrying that particular prep school drawl designed to sound casual while cutting deep, Alexander's response was ice. She didn't trade anything. She built something from nothing, which is more than most people in this room can claim. The silence that followed was delicious, broken only by the clink of someone's glass hitting a table too hard. But I had no idea what was coming next. The engagement toasts began, and Marcus took the microphone with the kind of confidence that comes from never facing real consequences. His posture relaxed, his smile wide and practiced. He told the story of how he met Vanessa, painting it as a fairy tale of perfect compatibility and shared values. He thanked his parents, his friends, everyone who had supported this union. And then, perhaps emboldened by champagne and the need to reclaim his narrative, he decided to acknowledge the elephant in the room. But I had no idea he would give me the perfect opening. He made a joke about past relationships, about how sometimes we need to make mistakes to find the right person, about how grateful he was to have found someone who truly understood his world. The room laughed, that particular wealthy person laugh that's more about social lubrication than genuine amusement. I felt Alexander tense beside me, his hand moving slightly toward mine in silent question. My heart was pounding now, my palms damp, every instinct screaming at me to stay silent, to let this moment pass, to take the high road. But something else was rising inside me, something that had been buried for too long under layers of shame and silence. But that moment would change everything. I wasn't angry anymore. I was calm, clearer than I had ever been, because I knew something Marcus didn't. During my months working with Alexander, I had been analyzing international transactions for our new fund. One of the companies we investigated was owned by Marcus's father, a commercial real estate firm that had been making suspicious deals with overseas investors. I hadn't been looking for dirt on Marcus's family. I had simply been doing my job, following the money, connecting the dots that most analysts missed because they assumed people with names like Whitfield were above scrutiny. What I found was a web of fraud. Inflated property values, kickback schemes, shell companies designed to hide assets and evade taxes. But I was wrong about keeping it quiet. Alexander had wanted to handle it quietly, to pass the information to the appropriate authorities without drama. But sitting there, listening to Marcus paint me as his learning experience, watching him bask in the approval of a crowd built on inherited wealth and unexamined privilege, I felt something shift inside me. I leaned over to Alexander and whispered, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "May I?" He studied my face for a long moment, his gray eyes searching mine for certainty, for understanding of what I was truly asking. Then he nodded slowly, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He understood what I was asking for, and he was giving me permission to take it. But I had no idea what that decision would cost them all. I stood up, my movement drawing attention as I walked toward the front of the room, my heels clicking on marble in a rhythm that felt like a countdown. Marcus saw me coming and his smile faltered, confusion replacing his earlier smugness, his eyes darting to Vanessa as if she might explain what was happening. I took the microphone gently from his hand, and before he could protest, I spoke. My voice was steady, clear, loud enough to fill every corner of the ballroom, and soft enough to make them lean in to hear every word. I congratulated him on his engagement, wished him well with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. And then I did something he never expected. I told the truth. I explained that during my recent work in international finance, I had uncovered irregularities in several commercial real estate transactions that would be of great interest to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the IRS. I didn't name his father's company directly. I didn't need to. The color draining from Marcus's face did that for me, spreading from his cheeks to his neck like he was being erased in real time. Someone gasped. A glass shattered somewhere in the back. Vanessa's hand flew to her mouth. And then I smiled, handed him back the microphone with exaggerated care, and returned to my seat as the room erupted into chaos. Voices rising, chairs scraping, the careful veneer of civility cracking apart like ice in spring. But everything they believed was about to collapse. The next 72 hours were a masterclass in how quickly power can dissolve when it's built on sand. The Wall Street Journal ran the story about Alexander's new fund with me as the lead strategist, complete with an interview about my background and approach to emerging markets. But buried in the business section was another story, smaller but devastating. SEC launches investigation into Whitfield properties following anonymous tip. The article didn't connect the dots publicly, but everyone who mattered knew exactly where that tip had originated. But that was only the beginning. Marcus called me 17 times that first day. I didn't answer. His messages evolved from angry to desperate to pleading, a fascinating character arc compressed into voicemails I listened to once and then deleted. Message 4, 2:47 a.m. You don't understand what you've done. This isn't just about me. You're destroying my entire family. His voice cracked on the word family. Message 11, 11:23 a.m. Please, just call me back. We can fix this. But there was nothing left to fix. He claimed I had misunderstood, that I was destroying his family out of spite, that this was revenge for a relationship that had ended badly. But the investigation wasn't revenge. It was justice. His father had been defrauding investors and evading taxes for years, and the only reason he had gotten away with it was because people assumed that men in expensive suits who belonged to the right clubs were above such things. But I had no idea how completely they would fall. The social fallout was swift and brutal, like watching a controlled demolition in slow motion. Vanessa broke off the engagement within a week, her family's lawyers moving faster than Marcus could process, the announcement terse and clinical. Due to unforeseen circumstances, the engagement has been mutually dissolved. His friends began distancing themselves with the kind of calculated cruelty they had once wielded against me. Texts left unread, invitations quietly rescinded, conversations that died the moment he entered a room. Invitations dried up. Business connections evaporated. The same people who had toasted his engagement were now pretending they barely knew him, rewriting history with the ease of those who had never had to face consequences for their revisions. But that moment would haunt him forever. Marcus's mother called me exactly once. She didn't threaten or plead. She simply asked why, her voice stripped of its usual polish, raw in a way I had never heard from her before. I told her the truth, because her son had tried to turn my humanity into his punchline, and because his father had built an empire on fraud while judging others for being poor. She was silent for a long moment, and I could hear her breathing, measured and controlled, fighting for composure. Then she said something that surprised me. She told me she had known about the company's irregularities, had warned her husband years ago that it would eventually catch up to them. But no one had listened to her either. We weren't so different, she and I, both women who had been underestimated by men who mistook power for intelligence. She didn't apologize, but she didn't attack either. She simply hung up, the click of the line going dead somehow final and absolute. And I never heard from any of them again. The fund launched to overwhelming interest, exceeding even Alexander's projections in the first quarter. Alexander and I spent the next 6 months building something revolutionary, an investment platform that identified undervalued markets and talented analysts who had been overlooked by traditional firms. We hired people like me, brilliant minds from non-traditional backgrounds who had the skills but not the connections. We focused on regions that Wall Street ignored, finding opportunities in places others were too lazy or too prejudiced to look. Within a year, we had outperformed every major fund on the market. But that was only the beginning. I moved into a penthouse in Tribeca, not because I needed the status, but because I finally could. Because the view of the Hudson at sunset felt like proof that I had earned the right to beautiful things. I hired my mother as our office manager, watching her face transform when she realized she would never have to work a double shift again, when she understood that her sacrifices had not been in vain. I established a scholarship fund at Columbia for first-generation college students studying economics. But that moment would open doors I never imagined. I spoke at conferences, wrote articles, sat for interviews where reporters were shocked to discover that the lead strategist of one of the most successful new funds in the country had grown up in Queens and once dated someone who tried to use her poverty as entertainment. But I had no idea how much further I could go. But the real victory wasn't the money or the recognition. It was the freedom to define myself on my own terms, to wake up every morning knowing that my worth wasn't subject to anyone else's validation. I ran into Marcus once, about 2 years after the engagement party, at a charity gala I was hosting for the scholarship fund. He looked smaller somehow, diminished, though his suit was still expensive and his smile still practiced. He tried to apologize, to explain, to somehow rebuild a bridge that had burned to ash and scattered in the wind. But everything he believed was wrong. I listened politely, then told him the truth. I didn't forgive him, but I also didn't think about him anymore. He had been a chapter in my story, a painful one. But I had written so many better chapters since then that his seemed distant and irrelevant, like something that had happened to a different person in a different lifetime. His eyes filled with something that might have been regret, or might have been self-pity. I didn't care enough to distinguish between the two. He nodded slowly, understanding finally that there was no path back, no redemption arc waiting for him in my narrative. And then he left, disappearing into the crowd of donors and dignitaries who would never know his name or care about his fall. But that closure was mine alone, and it was perfect. Alexander remained my partner, my mentor, my friend. People speculated about whether we were together romantically, as if that was the only way to explain why a powerful man would invest in a woman's potential. But our relationship was something more valuable than romance. It was mutual respect, shared vision, and the recognition that the best partnerships are built on seeing each other clearly rather than needing each other desperately. He had given me a platform, but I had built the empire, and that distinction mattered more than any fairy tale ending ever could. I still have that invitation sometimes, tucked away in a drawer in my office alongside the first check I ever earned, the Columbia acceptance letter my mother cried over, the Wall Street Journal article that changed everything. I keep it not as a reminder of pain, but as evidence of transformation. Proof that the girl who received it and the woman who holds it now are connected by courage rather than circumstance. Marcus had wanted to bury me with that invitation, to trap me in a moment of humiliation that would define the rest of my life. But he had fundamentally misunderstood who I was and what I was capable of becoming. The world that rejected me hasn't changed much. There are still Marcus Whitfields everywhere, still people who measure worth by pedigree rather than performance, still systems designed to keep certain people out while pretending to value merit. But I had learned something they never would, that true power doesn't come from inheritance or connections. It comes from the refusal to accept other people's definitions of your limits. It comes from building something real when everyone expects you to disappear. It comes from understanding that their approval was never the prize. Your own integrity was. I think about that night at the Peninsula Hotel sometimes. The moment when I stepped out of that Rolls-Royce and watched their certainty crumble like ancient paper exposed to light. It wasn't the luxury that mattered, or the shock on their faces. It was the realization that I had never needed their world to succeed. I had simply needed to stop believing that their rejection defined my reality. They had tried to write me into their story as a victim, a cautionary tale, a girl who reached too high and learned her lesson. But I had taken the pen from their hands and written something better. A story about resilience, justice, and the quiet power of refusing to stay buried. They tried to bury her. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that she had already become the storm. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to prove yourself to people who underestimated you? What did that transformation feel like? And if you're enjoying these stories of resilience and justice, subscribe to the channel. There are so many more stories to tell, and I promise each one is worth your time. Thank you for being here.